count 5.
Good evening, and thank you so much for taking the time to join in our digital conversation tonight. We're going to be having another Turning Point special that airs tomorrow night at 7 o'clock. Of course, that's when we talk about disparities within our community, especially when it comes to race, ethnicity, and things like that. Tomorrow, we're going to be specifically focusing on health disparities and racism. And so tonight we wanted to focus a little bit more on the Native American community. And so we have some wonderful guests joining us for this very important conversation. And I would love for them to first of all introduce themselves to you so you can get an idea of who you're going to be hearing from tonight. And remember, if you have any questions, please put them down in the comments. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to do so. And we're going to get to those within this half hour. So Dr. Stephanie Freiberg, I'd like to start with you. Could you please introduce yourself, where you work, and tell us a little bit about the work that you do?
Yes, I'm a professor at the University of Michigan in the Department of Psychology. And half of my work, I'll say, because I really have 2 lines of research, but the relevant work here is that I study bias against Native Americans. And in particular, how does changing the narrative about Native people both enhance the lives of Native people, but also decrease racism in America?
And Jeremiah?
Hi, my name is Jeremiah. I'm the Vice Chairman of the Advisory Board for Native Americans at NASA Glenn. This allows me to visit many nations across the United States, reach out to our youth, and help them get focused on STEM careers. I also work with the community, the Native communities here in Cleveland, Ohio. Thank
you. And last but not least, Cynthia.
Ani Dindi Sequoia Indishnakas, Aji Jakandotum, Waganakasingo Dawa, and Donjaba. My Anishinaabe name is Blue Jay Woman. You can call me Cynthia Connolly. I am from the Little Traverse Bay Bands of Odawa Indians located in northern Michigan. I'm from the Crane Clan. I live here in Cleveland, Ohio. I serve on the executive board of the Lake Erie Native American Council, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that serves the Native American community here in Cleveland. And some of our major work is culture classes, a lot of educational opportunities, such as things you're viewing here tonight. And we do a lot of Heritage Month events and really a lot of community building and raising the visibility and awareness of Native Americans in the 21st century.
Thank you so much. And joining me in facilitating this discussion, Dave DeNatale. Thank you again. It's good to be here with you for this very important discussion. So I want to start with this. Our executive producer, Margaret Bernstein, she kind of helped, put this conversation together and come up with an idea of where this conversation should go. And what we want to start with is a little bit more about stereotypes and bias towards Native Americans. How does that affect self-image? And then can you relate that to mental health within the community as well? I don't know, Dr. Fryberg, if you might want to start.
Sure, it's a very important question. One of the things that we know is that you can't be a self by yourself. We exist in social worlds, and as such, we have both our understanding of ourselves as tribal people, but we also have an understanding of ourselves through the people we engage with. And so these representations, romantic, negative, however limited the representations of Native people are, have a large impact. Not only, it isn't necessarily that we believe those limited representations, it's that part of being a self is that you have to contend with them. And so often what we're talking about is having to overcome a teacher's expectation of us, a professor, a coach, right? Important other people who do impact how we relate to consequential domains such as education. And so much of when we think about the work that we do, we're both looking at how these images affect us personally. Lowered self-esteem, lowered community efficacy. When we stereotype a group, we change what they see as possible for themselves in the future. And so, we've seen everything from these very social, psychological, like self-esteem issues, all the way to more depression, suicide ideation. It absolutely matters how we represent a group. And in this case, we're talking about a group that not only has to rail against a limited number of representations, but we have to rail against invisibility. Invisibility is the modern form of discrimination against Native people today. And so what does it mean to create a self when the world is telling you you don't exist, or better yet, you don't exist as a contemporary person? And so these are the issues that we tackle on the day-to-day.
And Cynthia, I don't know if you want to jump in. Like, I feel like I had a conversation with you, last week or the week before, and it reminded me of us talking about the fact that the Native American community is often, misrepresented, undercounted as well. Talk a little bit about that, or if you want to add something else.
Yeah, so there's actually a lot of, it's really humbling to be on here with Dr. Stephanie Fryberg, because she's an expert in this field. So I feel like I might be reiterating a lot of her own work. So I think one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is the getting data for Native people is inherently flawed. The way that it's usually done, like the polling that everyone resorts back when they talk about mascots and things to the Annenberg survey, the Sports Illustrated survey, the WAPO survey. And I think what Dr. Stephanie Freiberg's work is very important is that it's treating our people as a diverse group of people. We're 574 federally recognized tribes, completely different and unique. And you can't put us in a monolith. And also approaching the surveys with a lot of these biases and misconceptions about who Native people are. And one of the things that we've really noticed is that there's actually a report that came out about 1.5 years ago called Reclaiming Native Truth, written by Crystal Echohawk, who's now over at Illuminatives, a national Native nonprofit that works on visibility and representation. And they found that 2/3 of Americans have never met a Native person. And so when you're thinking of that statistic, if you think about how much you learn from another person by interacting with them day to day, you learn a great deal. And, we're like less than 2% of the nation's population. So the odds of you having that interaction with a Native person is a little bit more difficult, that genuine day-to-day interaction. And so that creates this void of who we are as a modern people. And that is filled with nothing but like racist stereotypes, misconceptions, bias, things we learn in elementary school, media, and they're never accurate to who we are represented today. It's always us existing in the 1800s. It was what I call feathered and leathered. So we're not your neighbors. We're never portrayed as your coworkers, your classmates. And so that's actually the bias that we're forced to overcome every single day. And it becomes incredibly exhausting. And to your point about the data, it's hard to understand how pervasive these problems are if you don't have accurate data of who you are. Just a couple weeks ago, it went viral on social media when CNN listed Native people in an exit poll for voting as something else. And to me, that's just another way of saying other. But putting in that phrase made it really obvious how harmful that can be in understanding and appreciating the contributions of Indigenous people in this country.
Maya, I'd ask if you have anything you'd like to add. I almost wonder, what's being done to kind of combat this, to overcome these issues as well. But Jeremiah, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Well, I don't want to reiterate all the points that were made because they're all very important. But it's very true that we need to be seen in modern contemporary lights. We're here, we're your neighbors. Like Cynthia said, we are your co-workers. We're often imagined in this Hollywood stereotype or seen as relics of a people who was once here, not a people that is still here. So I think it's important to remember that.
Cynthia, you mentioned a minute ago about the mascot and the mascot issue, just kind of the sports issue. And I've covered sports in Cleveland for 22 years, and I've gone to opening days at Cleveland Indians games every year. And, it's amazing to me, the I don't want to say ignorance, but maybe that's fair. It's just that, the lack of, I think, people to have empathy for, as you put it, Cynthia, there are so many, it's not a monolith. There are so many tribes and so many people who have, that the Chief Wahoo, the name Indians, all of that impacts, affects, stigmatizes. It's hard to put kind of a value on that, but I feel like now the Indians are obviously listening. The Washington football team is listening. Maybe we're starting to see in that realm a bit of a change. Do you agree?
Yeah, I certainly hope so. And I think one of the big things that we're looking at right now, and I think Dr. Fryberg can chime in here, is with the city of Cleveland declaring racism a public health crisis. Her research shows that that is the case, that we are seeing these negative outcomes in our community, and we're seeing that reflected in our own community. When I go to give presentations on Native, talking about visibility, to the first part of your statement there, I give presentations from K through 12 to senior centers, libraries, and the first question I ask is, picture a Native American in your head, and what's the first thing that comes to your mind? And it's always feathers, teepees, Chief Wahoo. And I follow that up with, can you name a living Native person today, like a modern, living, still alive Native American person today? And crickets. And it's really tough because I just introduced myself as an Indigenous woman, and they could have literally just said my name. But they can't overcome that logical leap of what Native people are supposed to be. And that's the big barrier that we're facing here, and we're seeing. The mascot is part of that huge picture of invisibility, of controlling the narrative of who we are, controlling our identity, taking that power from us to identify who we are, how we want to be acknowledged, who we want to be called, and that's a big struggle, especially when you're working professionally in this sector. And I'll have Dr. Freiberg can probably chime in a little bit more on her research to that.
Well, I want to chime in. I think that there's a couple of issues in what has been said. Number one, the Washington team and the Cleveland team did not come about their change in the same way. Washington came about it begrudgingly, and I truly believe will never apologize for the systemic racism that they created by holding on to a racial slur as their mascot. And whereas Cleveland has struggled with this a little bit longer, made the choice to get rid of their logo before being forced to. I know there's been a tremendous amount of activism, grassroots on the ground efforts to make them change and to help them see. But I also have had some interactions and with a number of people in Cleveland over the years, and Cleveland is sitting in a different place. As a city, Cleveland has the opportunity to come about this change in a good way. You really get the sense from people connected to the organization that there's a real desire to figure out how to both recognize the ways in which they've engaged in systemic racism through the use of the mascot. But that's part of the larger issue. I mean, we're talking about a time where, for the first time ever, Native people are being taken seriously. Mm-hmm. There's a way in which our voices on this issue have been erased, and that erasure has been extremely powerful. And so when we talk about possible selves, we talk about who we want children to be in the future, like, we have to start by letting Native people define themselves. Stop telling us what's good for us. We know, and we're telling you it's not okay. There's literally decades of research showing that these types of representations are adversely impacting Native people and Native communities. How is that not enough? At what point does an attitude poll trump psychological harm? And so I think there's really a bigger issue. What are we allowing? What are we depending on as being real evidence? I believe in science, right? And my bias, I'm a scientist, but I believe in science. And science tells us a whole lot about the power of these representations. And so my hope is that as we continue to have these conversations, I've been on with a couple of different public panels and that in the city of Cleveland, and the questions that come up amaze me. I mean, people are really thinking seriously about what's happening. So I actually feel hopeful about both the Cleveland organization. I feel hopeful about people in the city of Cleveland, because I do think that the people can see the problem. And some of it is that it's very connected to the issues that Black people face in America. And that's important to recognize, that we are walking and dealing with the same people who are the problem, right? We're in this boat together. And so I'm really thinking that, you know, we may have turned a corner, and I'm hopeful about Cleveland.
Yeah, the whole, just to tag on to that, what happened this spring and summer, I think really highlighted how racism and these things live on a systemic level, right? A lot of the attitude-based polling that Dr. Freiberg was bringing up, I mean, that's really not the question. You know, yes, it's offensive for the record, but also whether or not an individual is offended does not undermine the fact that this is sitting on a systemic level that impacts you whether you like it or not. Impacts our community as a whole, impacts a larger group of people. So that's one thing that I think has changed this summer, is just the shifting of the conversation from are you personally offended to this is actually a systemic problem that needs some very real solutions. And the mascot is one piece of this, this puzzle that we need to resolve.
I would like to say something, but Jeremiah, if you want to jump in, I don't want to keep the, okay. So, I mean, one thing that I want to say is I also think that America's underestimating the extent to which Native people are mobilized. So much of what happened with the Washington football team was mobilized by Native people. These efforts and the ways in which we're working together, researchers, philanthropists, Native organizers across the country, I have never, like, it's the most exciting time in my life, because I see the ways in which we're all connected. We've got a vision. We're trying to push that vision forward. And we've reached a point where we're not going to stop. You know, much of our efforts on the Indigenous Futures Study were about galvanizing the Native vote. And we did, and it mattered in a number of states. And I think we're here to say that we're not going to let you continue to render us invisible. We are here. We're not going anywhere. And I think that, you know, Cynthia brought up the something else. So we've just collected data on something else. And, you know, part of what we're trying to get at is the recent presidential election. There was a poll by the Associated Press that suggested that the majority of Native people voted for Donald Trump. We collected the largest national study ever of Indigenous people this past summer. Nearly 6,500 Native people from across Indian country, sent out through tribes, through urban organizations, really getting at something that these polls can't get at. So they represented us through 500 people. 6,460 people tell us that 50% of them are Democrat. Another 17% are Socialist Democrat. When you get down to Republican, it's 7%. So there's no way that 54% of Native people voted for Donald Trump. On top of that, and I think to push it even further, 77% of Natives said they voted in the last election. And so we are now following up with some data, and, you know, we've literally just, the poll is ending today, but some preliminary analysis, we're seeing that 91% of we're close to 4,000 Natives who took the survey are saying, I voted for Joe Biden and I voted for change, and I'm bothered by something else. I don't trust the US government. I don't try, and my lack of trust for the government is affecting my well-being, my happiness, how I'm dealing with the pandemic. It's affecting every aspect of our life. And our distrust for the government has widespread. 94% of Native people in that 6,500 sample said, I don't trust the US government to make good decisions for Native people. Think about that, 94%. And then you add to that only 34% of Native people said they felt hopeful about the direction our country is going. Like those, when you think about well-being, those are alarming numbers, because they're predicting well-being. So I can't emphasize enough how important it is for America to recognize that we're not going away. We're one of the fastest growing groups in America. We're mobilizing, we're out here ready to make change. And, you know, I just think the more powerful tale is going to come out.
You know,
I just want to emphasize that to our point that we very much are strong and resilient people, and we've overcome many obstacles, and we haven't been and won't be erased. And just a little piece of history, so you understand how recent some of the stuff our people face is. In a country that was founded on the freedom of religion, we were not able to legally practice our own religions until 1978. I mean, I was alive for this. So if that doesn't tell you something, we are still being oppressed at that legal level almost until the 80s. So it's something to remember. This has been a long ongoing fight. But.
You know, something that was mentioned was portrayals, especially within schools. And I kind of want to get back to that, especially with Thanksgiving approaching. Jeremiah, I'll start with you. Your thoughts on how the history of Native Americans is portrayed in schools. I can only imagine, like, I know what I was taught, right? Which like wasn't the full truth when I was in school. Are we seeing a change now, do you think?
Well, I would hope so. You know, I like to think that with the dawn of the internet age and more information is readily available, that perhaps it wasn't when we were coming up. You know, history books were written by the winners, and a lot of things were changed and to sound more advantageous, and they certainly soften the edges of a lot of things that happen to make it a more palatable story. So I like to say that, you know, I believe that this internet age is giving us a voice. We're being able to network together. We're being able to share our truths, the true history of this country as it happened and not as it was rewritten. So I hope it's changing. I think we have the opportunity and the resources for change right
now. Anyone else want to chime in?
Yeah, so I had mentioned the study a little bit earlier, Reclaiming Native Truth, and one of the findings that they have from that study is that 87% of K through 12 curriculum fails to mention Native Americans after the year 1900. 87%. So only 13% of the schools in this country talk about Native people after 1900. So we're talking, as I said before, you know, we're permanently stuck in the history, feathered and leathered. And when you have that kind of you know, bias built in from a young age, and it starts with Columbus Day and Thanksgiving. That is usually a child's first exposure to Indigenous themes in the classroom. And it's often these stereotypes, these myths, and these false narratives. And it's really difficult to change those as they get older, because one, it's not even being talked about. And often you don't learn about the actual truth until, if you maybe are lucky, take a college course. I actually wrote for the YWCA of Greater Cleveland, the Racial Equity and Social Justice Challenge, a personal story. So I grew up in Detroit, full disclosure, and I went to, when I was in elementary school, the Ann Arbor Natural History Museum. And in this museum, on the final floor, they had these dioramas of Native Americans. And I guess they tried to make it a little bit more woke and like put like, you know, Native tribes of Michigan. And so I turned to, and again, we have 3 floors. 4th floor is the last one. 1st floor is fossils, dinosaur bones, extinct animals, and then the final floor, Native Americans. I turned to my classmate and I say, I'm Native American like this. And he said, you can't be Indian. Indians are extinct. And to me, as you know, a kid, I was more upset about being called a liar. And I didn't really understand like how deep that experience was for me. And I wasn't the only one with that story. As like, you know, as I meet some of my friends when I was an undergrad at Michigan, they had similar stories. We're presented to children in this historical element, surrounded by, you know, again, dinosaur bones, fossils, dodo birds, and what do you expect a 9-year-old child to think? And so that kind of placement and education of us as these historical people really fails to talk about who we are as a modern people, and really fails, you know, as your 9-year-old kid, natives are extinct. And I really feel like just shifting how we're talked about in schools. I think K through 12 schools should really do an audit of their curriculum and see, are you talking about Native Americans after 1900, bare minimum, and maybe changing some state history standards.
So I'm going to jump in. So one thing, I want to give a little shout out to Sarah Shears because the 87%, so I'm one of the lead researchers on Reclaiming Native Truths, but the 87% is not from Reclaiming Native Truths. It's from Sarah Shears, who's an assistant professor in education, and they have studied the K-12 curriculum across the country and found that 87% of those representations represent in that curriculum represents Natives in a pre-1900 context. And that data point is so powerful, and we use it often because it's so meaningful. But I want to just also tag on to what Cynthia was saying and recognize where we are right now. Next week is Thanksgiving. My family doesn't celebrate Thanksgiving. We call it Truthsgiving. When I had children, decided I would never expose my children to the lies that are Thanksgiving. And what's really interesting to me is the number of scholars that I know who study stereotyping and prejudice, who know the truth about history, the true history about Thanksgiving. So what Americans don't realize is the first feasts of Thanksgiving were conducted every time hundreds of Native people were killed. And a decision was made at a particular point that it was probably not okay to have these feasts so often. So we decided to have it once a year. And so literally, like, I joke, but that's the turkey of death for Native people. We have been sold the same story. But when we continue these narratives, they have adverse effects for our children. Our children walk through a world where our people are struggling. And I remember trying to explain to my daughter's kindergarten teacher when she did this whole thing about Columbus, and it was totally false what she was doing. And I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. But there was a point where basically I had to, definitely more vinegar than honey, but where I had to like sort of say, like, this is not appropriate. If you teach my child that this romanticized story of Columbus is true, then when my child walks down the road, we drive down the reservation and we see people who are struggling with addiction, who are homeless, then one can only think there's something wrong with our people. But when you know the true history, and when you teach my child the true history, she sees that while some of us have been able to overcome, we still have people who are struggling to overcome that colonial history. And we are still being oppressed in so many ways. And so to give my child a true understanding of the plight of contemporary Native people, you have to tell the truth about Thanksgiving. You have to tell the truth about Columbus. You have to include Native people in the history of US. And the number of times that we're left out of 27 states' history curriculum. How is that even possible, right? It's total erasure. And so these narratives adversely impact not just how our children see themselves, but absolutely our well-being.
One example I like to give, talking about visibility and invisibility, there's a school that I toured, and I asked them, they have a beautiful Nelson Mandela banner hanging from the staircase, hello in the languages of all the world. And I had given that presentation about my experience as a young child at the museum, and highlighted some of the Dr. Freibergs research and all of these things. And I had a parent say, I just really don't understand, like, what exactly do you mean? Is there like a firm example you can say about how you're invisible? And I said, well, look at this wall with hello in the languages of all, of the entire world, except for the indigenous languages of the land, the people we're standing on, like this land that we're standing on. There was no Ani or Bushu, my people came down here during the winter months, but it wasn't even thought of to be included on that wall. And this is indigenous land. That's the invisibility, and that's the erasure. And it wasn't until an indigenous person came into the school, and usually that's when teachers realize, that there is an actual problem. Like, oh, I just realized I've been sharing this book. This might be wrong. They wait for a parent or a family to arrive to highlight that there's a problem. That's when the aha moment hits. Again, we're 2% of the population. I can't be in every classroom. I can't be in every lobby, making people's heads explode as they see that there's no Indigenous language on the wall. I mean, so we really need people to start stepping up and looking at their own curriculum. As a parent, what materials are coming home from your schools and your teachers, and start, thinking about how you yourself are learning about Native people. I have people ask me, well, how can I learn more? We do know that people want to learn more about Indigenous people in history. And I say, do it the way I do it. How do you get your news for, the rest of this country? You follow people on Twitter, subscribe to, like some things on Facebook, listen to some podcasts. This Land came out recently, and it is an incredible podcast that really gets into the nitty gritty details of federal Indian policy law. They do like a couple subsequent follow-up podcasts, and it was about a Supreme Court case. There's another really great one by Matika Wilbur and Dr. Adrienne Keene called All My Relations. I mean, we all listen to podcasts, we follow people on Twitter. Do the same for Native people and start, digesting this news the way that my family does.
Well, we're going to have to wrap things up, but Jeremiah, I just want to give you a chance if there are any final thoughts you'd like to make.
Well, I'd just like to thank you actually for giving us the opportunity to have our voices heard on your show this evening. And as people do come in to the holiday this week, I'd hope that they'd remember a lot of the things they learned here and think about that and think about the Indigenous people that they're celebrating or told they're celebrating, right, this week. So, but thank you for your time and giving us a voice. Niawe.
Well, we definitely thank all of you for taking the time to do this. Dino, I don't know if you have any final things you want to say.
No, this was an honor. You guys, we've already had people on Facebook saying, I got to go back. Can I go back and watch this from the beginning? Yes, this will be available on WKYC.com. We put it on YouTube. So yes, this will be available. You can go back and watch this entire conversation because it is very worthwhile.
It's been very eye-opening. I really enjoyed this conversation. And I think we all have work to do after hearing what I'm hearing today. But again, we just want to remind you that Turning Point, our next edition will be tomorrow night. That is Thursday night at 7 o'clock in place of Front Row. So you'll see our Turning Point special then. And until then, have a good night.